On today's program, neuroscientists Ogas and Gaddam. Their first book they wrote together was the widely lauded 1 Billion Wicked Thoughts What the Internet Tells Us About Sexual Relationships, in which they analyze the most extensive data set ever assembled on human desire. They're now out with a new book, Grand in Scope, that aims to offer a unified account of the mind itself. The book, Journey of the Mind: How Thinking Emerged from Chaos, traces the development of the mind from the simplest single cell organisms through amoeba, worms, fish, monkeys, all the way up to humans. How did today's civilization, language, and the very idea of the self emerge from an inhospitable, unrecognizable planet 3 billion years ago? And are we modern humans the end point? Well, to discuss this and more, I'm pleased to welcome Ogas and Gaddam.
Thank you. It's a real thrill to be here.
Great to be on.
Let's start with you, Gaddam. Halfway across the world, you are in India now. Why this book? What made you want to, along with your colleague Ogas, create a unified account of this sort of unfathomable progression of developments?
Well, Ogi and I have been interested in the mind for as long as possible. We met in grad school because we had that shared obsession. Ogi came from a different, he had a different interest. I came from an electrical engineering background. Mine was more engineering oriented. How do you construct a mind? Ogi was always interested in consciousness. I think he'll tell you why. And this is a result of that passion and even obsession, I guess. How do we think? How do we feel? What do these things even mean? Now, there are a lot of neuroscience books that talk about this, but what we wanted to do was sort of step back and look at all sorts of minds, not just human minds, to try and understand what these things are. What is thinking? What is the mind? And the journey of the mind is a result of this interest of ours.
I'd like to hear from you, Ogi. What can you add to that about also your obsession with the consciousness?
Yeah, so my own interest was trying to explain how consciousness works. And one of our objectives in taking readers on this 3 billion year journey of the mind is to help people without any math or science background understand how consciousness actually works and how language works, and especially how the personal self works, our experience that I am me, our awareness of our own self. How do these actually work? These have been baffling mysteries that have entranced and beguiled humans for millennia, and quite famously, very difficult to figure things out. But it turns out that by retracing the voyage of thinking on Earth from the simplest minds, we start out, as you pointed out, with the tiniest minds on Earth, the minds of archaea, and then we progress through protozoa and bacteria, jellyfish, worms, insects, fish, reptiles, mammals, all the way up. By taking this step-by-step journey, it's possible to see the specific mental innovations, the specific physical developments in the mind that enabled consciousness to form. And when you proceed in this way, by telling the story of thinking, it's possible to see consciousness emerge out of chaos in a very clear way. And it's very important in our book. You don't need to know any math. There's no equations. We have a lot of helpful diagrams, illustrations to help explain things work. What we want more than anything else is for readers to come away feeling that they have a much better understanding of how these magical forms of thinking and experience, how feeling, thinking, knowing, experience, self-awareness, how these actually work and inform our experience of reality.
Talk to us about the very beginning. One of you, talk to us about what the planet was like 3 billion years ago as you describe. I think many people, I used in the introduction the word unrecognizable. Many people would have no idea if you could show a picture or a video of what was happening on Earth 3 billion years ago. They say it's impossible. It's the same place as it is to now with our beautiful oceans and mountains and lakes and streams and great forests, I think they'd say impossible. But so here we have this place which you'll describe, and then these archaea. These, what are these exactly? Because and you're right, by the way, not knowing science and math in depth, which is certainly a description of me, made it absolutely very possible to read and enjoy the book. So thank you for that and the helpful descriptions. But talk about the early planet and these archaea. What's going on?
So I'll describe the early planet, which it's very speculative. We don't know a great deal about what the early Earth was like, but we sure know it was very, very different than the Earth today. As one thing, the moon was much lower, much closer to the Earth and much bigger in the sky. And the Earth was actually rotating much faster. I think it revolved once every 8 hours, which is much faster, 3 times faster than it is today. The atmosphere was completely different. No oxygen. The atmosphere was filled with poison. If any living creature, if any living animal today was alive back then, they die of suffocation very quickly. And the oceans were not the beautiful, pristine, clear water that we associate today. They too were sludgy and mucky and full of stuff. And so in this totally alien and inhospitable environment, life first arose. Now, here's something very important about the journey of the mind. The journey of the mind did not begin with the earliest life. There was a long period of time, somewhere around a billion years. It's hard to pin down this exact duration, but for some extensive, very long period of time, there was living creatures, but no minds. All they did, they reproduced, they had metabolism, the 2 fundamental hallmarks of life, but they didn't think. They just, if they were in the water, they just floated around aimlessly. They drifted around. If they were on rocks or harder substances, they just stayed in one place and did their thing. So the origin of the mind happened somewhere, maybe about 1 billion years after the origin of life. And it required a revolution. It required the emergence of a molecule, or maybe a collection of molecules that served as a sensor, and a molecule, or again, a collection of molecules that served as a kind of doer that did something. And again, completely speculative, and it's probably impossible to ever accurately reconstruct what the very first mind on Earth might have been. But there's some hints about what the first mind might have been based on the very simplest microscopic minds on Earth, which, as you pointed out, are known as the archaea. Archaea are single-celled little creatures that are even older and smaller than bacteria. So some entity, probably a lot like an archaea, maybe even an archaea, developed the first sensor and the first doer. And this combination, maybe the sensor detected some nutrition in the environment, or perhaps most likely, it detected sunlight, because there were early creatures that processed the sun for energy. So if there was a creature that had a molecule that detected sunlight, and maybe it had a molecule that served as a lash, all of the tiniest creatures on Earth these days and that are around today use flagella, little whips to move around. So if the first mind had a sensor that sensed light, and when it sensed light, it triggered a little flagella. If it moved towards light with a probability greater than chance, that would have been the very first mind, because it would have outcompeted in the merciless struggle of natural selection.
And I want to add to that whip, the flagella, is what made that first mind possible. So it's not it's not the thinking elements in some ways, it's what you could do, because there's no reason to have any thinking if you cannot really act on the environment. And this is really interesting, Daniel, as you pointed out. The world then was unrecognizable, and it was unrecognizable because minds, bodies, and the environment are always working together. Minds change the environment by allowing their bodies to act on the environment. Ogi pointed out how there's no oxygen, but how did oxygen come to be? It is when organisms started exhaling oxygen, and some would say that we are doing our very best to change the world and make it unrecognizable, maybe 100, 200 years from now. But that's what minds do. They change the environments that they're in.
But how could oxygen come from nowhere. I mean, is this what happened first? I mean, you say, well, breathing helps create oxygen, but of course, then the mind naturally wonders, well, which came first? I mean, from this pollution and this poisonous, noxious atmosphere to suddenly oxygen. Was this also around the 1 billion year ago mark versus the 3 billion year ago mark, meaning uh, existing organisms, and then 2 billion years later somehow doing and the sensing?
So we're not experts on the origins of life. And so some part of a good answer to that, we'll get into a little more detail about maybe some of the elements of the biochemistry of early life. But we do know that the very first creatures that existed on Earth seem to have been sulfur-based, perhaps methane-based, but they were not oxygen-based. But eventually, organisms arose that excreted oxygen as a waste product. And so over many, many hundreds of millions of years, oxygen, which was waste from these tiny, tiny creatures, tiny ancient creatures, gradually built up in the atmosphere until there was something called the Great Oxygenation Event that caused, for the first time, the skies to clear. That was when, for the first time, if you were in a spaceship hovering around Earth, you could have actually looked through the sky and seen the beautiful continents down below. Probably there was a single continent back then, I believe, not sure about that. But until this great oxygenation event, you would not have been able to see very far. It would have been just an awful smog around you all the time. But it's most likely the case that the first minds were oxygen processing creatures, but we certainly don't know. And there may have been minds in creatures that were based on sulfur or methane instead, just no way of knowing.
Talk about some of the animals that come up in this book. I'm curious, in the course of your research, what you discovered about certain animals that you found interesting or surprising, or maybe things you expected. Obviously, we think of humans, and then we think of other intelligent animals that are nothing near the level of humans, obviously, but chimpanzees we hear about a lot, of which you have a chapter, dolphins, other various animals that are, yes, intelligent. You delve a lot, for example, into birds and how birds are incredible at reproducing sounds, almost any sound they can hear, incredible vocal capacity, but yet there is no communication in the sense of ideas in the moment. As you say, they can warn other birds about predators, but they can't make plans to, hang out at the park tomorrow. So what is happening here? We talk about this development. So take us into a bit of detail about some of the animals that thrilled you.
I was going to draw attention to a creature that probably most people never think about, but is actually crucially important in the history of thinking on Earth, and that is the roundworm. The technical name for the roundworm is C. elegans. It's a tiny, sometimes they're called nematodes. This is a tiny, tiny creature. I think it's its greatest length, it's a millimeter long, but usually it's microscopic. You can't see it with a naked eye. And the soil is filled with these creatures. Roundworms are decomposers. They feed on bacteria. They help in the soil. They help break things down. And this tiny and very ancient creature, this creature was around before there was any life, before there was any animals on land. So when life was still all in the ocean, C. elegans was there in the ocean too. So very, very old creature, hasn't changed much over the years. So why is this tiny, tiny ancient roundworm so important in the journey of the mind? Because it's the first mind that has centralized thinking. Until the roundworm, all thinking in minds, whether the microscopic minds of bacteria or protozoa or jellyfish, which is another creature that's a bit simpler than the roundworm, all of these other creatures did not have any centralized thinking. They thought throughout their entire body. Any thinking element, any part of their body was as good at thinking as any other part of the body. But when the roundworm, for the first time, it solved this problem, the problem of how do I coordinate all the parts of my body? If my head's doing one thing, how do I make sure that my head's doing something that makes sense with what the tail's doing? Let's make sure that if I smell poison, but I also smell some food, that I figure out a way to resolve these so that, maybe they're pulling me in different directions. How do I resolve this? So this tiny roundworm developed 10 neurons, a set of 10 neurons that acts as a kind of brain. It's not a brain, but it acts in the same role as a brain by controlling everything else, all the other neurons in the roundworm mind. And so this,
so
I'm just
I
going
want
to tie that up.
I
Good.
Okay, sorry, I just want to step back a little, because as Ogi pointed out, there's like almost a beautiful and bewildering complexity. Anywhere you look, life forms that are capable of doing some things that we just don't expect them to do. Our focus is on thinking, and our focus is on minds. And I think it's important to understand why we're looking at these different animals, why we're looking at roundworms, flatworms, fruit flies, humans, self-driving cars up to a certain point. They're not animals, but all of these are minds. And that really is where we wanted to focus, right? Why look at all these animals? To understand our minds. And why is that? It starts with what we think is very, very important, the definition of the mind itself. What's common, what unifies all of these animals, including the roundworms and flatworms and fruit flies, archaea, bacteria, is they all have minds which convert sensory inputs, that is, whatever the world is, is streaming into their bodies, and converting those into behavioral outputs. In the case of roundworms, being able to crawl their way through soil, look up to see if there's any predators. That's sensory inputs converted into behavioral outputs. That's what minds do, and crucially in the welfare of the body. And what bodies? These are the beautiful, diverse, bewildering animals that we encounter in Journey of Mind.
When you talk about mind, where do you draw the line between this receiving inputs and doing something, which some of the simplest, least sophisticated organisms do, and then suddenly something that is conscious? What animal was the first conscious animal, in fact? And this list is, of course, representative of many animals that we recognize. So what could we humans relate to as being the first animal to feel consciousness, to wonder?
So this is one of the most remarkable takeaways from going on the journey of the mind, is that it becomes possible to identify the first creature to attain consciousness. And that creature was fish. Fish were the first beings on earth to be conscious. Now, how do we know this? So I want to step back and share something. We share this in the book. There is a mathematical account of consciousness that we explain in the book. We explain it in non-mathematical terms, but it's based on a very elaborate, sophisticated mathematical account of consciousness that's been developed over the past almost 65 years. And from this mathematical account, we can derive 3 laws of consciousness, 3 laws of consciousness. And we can use these laws as an objective, practical way to evaluate whether any creature is conscious, whether that creature is as small as a bacteria or a fish or a person or even a machine or even a city or a country. We'll get to those later. But what are the 3 laws of consciousness, and how can we use them to know that fish were the first creatures to become conscious? The first law of consciousness is that all conscious states, all conscious experiences are resonant states. What is a resonant state? Resonance is the magic behind consciousness. It is the physical dynamic, the physical activity in our brain that's happening anytime we have a conscious experience. Resonance is a specific dynamic that involves the comparison of 2 mental representations. So if you look at something, let's say I'm holding a bottle of water, the image coming in, the sensory input coming in is compared to my memory of what bottles look like. And if what I'm looking at matches my memory of a bottle, these 2 representations resonate in my brain. And resonance is the physical embodiment of a conscious experience. So back to our question, what was the first creature to become conscious? If the creature doesn't have resonance, if a creature doesn't have mental representations, then it can't possibly be conscious. And so using that fact alone, we can say that almost every creature that's ever existed on Earth, and most creatures that exist today, are not conscious. The second law of consciousness is also crucial. It says that—
Can I add something there?
Oh, go ahead.
Before we get into that?
Yes.
I just want to say that a lot of people who might be coming in right now might say, wait, what? Fish are conscious? I think, and this might be because everything we said about what needs to happen in the minds in terms of dynamics, that needs, and we need that for consciousness. But first, for us to even appreciate and acknowledge that fish can be conscious, we have to arrive at maybe a common definition of that. And that means so hard because it's so circular. Consciousness is, we look at it from a privileged perspective, right? We think that we are utterly unique in the world, perhaps the universe, in being conscious. But what exactly is that? And this is where philosophers, everyone, they hem and they haw, and they finally come down to the subjective feeling of what it feels. And that's, again, a fuzzy definition. It's just words. And so what we need to know as consciousness is a specific kind of activity. And again, stems from the definition of the mind, a specific kind of activity that does something. And what is it? What does it do? It allows these minds, as they get more complex, to take in a very complex world. Fish, their worlds are as complex as ours. They're full of predators. They have to figure out where they are. They might be hidden. They might be camouflaged. How do you figure out what's happening in that world? You need to only let in a few things in that chaotic scene. And consciousness is what is the specific dynamic activity that allows that to distill, to filter the world, and only take in things that can impact us. And once we see from this perspective that consciousness is this activity, then I think we will all be a lot more willing to accept that even fish perhaps share this with us, and that we're not so wonderfully unique in the world in terms of being the only conscious beings.
But how can fish have such a complex world when all they're doing is basically trying to stay alive and stay healthy and maybe protect their family or something for as long as possible? I mean, how complex can the world be without music and literature and architecture and politics?
Well, what is so defining about fish minds and all vertebrate minds, all minds of creatures that have backbones, fish, amphibians, birds, reptiles, mammals, what they all share in common is they inhabit worlds where objects matter, where rocks and stones and seaweed and other fish, where things and events matter. And for a mind to be able to manage objects, for a mind to be able to think about and learn about and make predictions about things and objects and events and other animals requires a very sophisticated mind. And as it turns out, it requires a conscious mind.
And I think that's a great question that you said. So they don't have literature, they don't have geopolitics. How is it that their worlds are complex? Well, here's the thing. So literature, geopolitics, all of that is only evolutionarily very, very young. It didn't take us very long to develop this sort of complexity. What is actually really, really hard is what we take for granted. When I'm seeing the screen, when I see you move behind your mic, I know that the mic is a separate object. I know that your face is not somehow coalescing into the mic some ways. And fish are solving this at every moment in their lives. And that is a hard problem. We again, I think it stems from this consciousness privilege or this anthropocentric privilege that, oh, wow, we are doing all of this. We must be awesome. We must be wonderful. And all that other stuff is, the mundane stuff, which is not really hard. But it turns out that if you look at the 3 billion year journey of our minds, we spent 99% of that figuring out all of this stuff. That's the hard stuff. What we have now is the easy stuff. That's a mere temporal speck in our timeline. And who knows how much more complexity we have waiting for us maybe 1,500 years down the line.
Let me add something else too, is that, Daniel, you mentioned, music and experience and some of these higher functions that we associate with the human experience, even things like science, art, our sophisticated suite of social relationships. All of these things that we associate with the human experience are actually the consequence not of consciousness, but of another mental dynamic, another part of the mind that's only in humans that sits on top of consciousness, and that is language. Only we have language, and language is a special physical dynamic in our brain that operates actually between brains. But the dynamics of language sit on top of the dynamics of consciousness. And it's the interaction between language and consciousness that provides us, and only us, with things like art and science and self-awareness, the ability to say, I am thinking about myself. I am having thoughts. No other creature does this. Even though other creatures are conscious, they are not self-conscious. They are not aware of themselves, because that requires a whole other layer of mental activity.
So let's talk for a minute about the extraordinary evolution of language. You spend a lot of time talking about language later on in the book. Of course, it's something that is necessary to think saliently, and it's not something that's been with us forever. But humans have language. What happened with humans that didn't happen with any other species?
That's a fantastic question. Why don't I start an answer, and then Sai, you can interrupt if if you think I'm going astray. So we're talking about the emergence of language, which is one of the biggest revolutions in the journey of thinking on Earth. It really happened over a series of stages of developing something called shared attention. So the dynamics that operate between minds, the mental activity that operates between different minds, requires shared attention. So, for example, the simplest form of shared attention is simply looking at another creature in its eyes. This is known as eye gazing. So just knowing, okay, I'm going to look at that creature's eyes, that was the first form of shared attention. I am orienting, targeting my thinking, putting my attention on this other creature's eyes. And then from there, other forms of shared attention gradually arose, such as shared focus, two creatures looking at the same thing at the same time. Gaze following, I skipped one, gaze following, looking in the same direction, the same thing that another mind is looking. Then two minds looking at the same thing at the same time. Then one mind performing an activity, perhaps with their hands. This is where humans start to separate from other creatures. For example, tool making. One human or creature, because this almost certainly emerged and evolved much earlier than Homo sapiens, one creature is making a tool, perhaps a rock axe, and the other human is watching the axe being formed. Again, shared attention, sharing attention on a sequence of actions. And then from there, perhaps gestures. This is when maybe pointing arose. One creature said, there, go there, look at this rock, eat that apple. Not talking, but just pointing. This is also a form of shared attention. Chimpanzees, who are the creatures that are closest to us in intelligence and the design of their mind, they do not point. Every human starts pointing within the first year of life, but it's very hard to teach chimps how to point. So this suggests that pointing emerged in humans a long time ago and was also key to this. So there was all these steps that each of these steps knitted together people's attention closer and closer together until finally we broke through in the great revolution of language. Language is the ultimate form of shared attention. As I'm sharing these words with you, Daniel, and your listeners, you are focused on the exact same things I am focused on. Your consciousness is on the same things that my consciousness is on. And this is a marvelous, marvelous achievement only done by humans. And it appears to have required hands. It appears to have acquired the ability to manipulate our hands. And the reason why probably only humans and not birds can speak with language is because we went through this intermediate stage of shared attention where we pointed, we used our hand to symbolize things, we watched our hands making things. Birds were way, way ahead of us on the shared attention game. They got to communication, vocalization, communication through birdsong, I think 65 million years ago, a long, long, long time ago, way longer before there was any pointing or gesticulation or even human ancestors yet. Birds were way ahead, but yet humans caught up to birds and then surpassed them really fast. It appears that not having hands, being stuck with these wings, prevented birds from talking, even though they had a massive head start on us.
That's just very, but before you jump in, Sai, it's just very fascinating to think about the relationship between the physical and the development of language. Who would think that limbs, hands? I mean, well, what about chimpanzees, for example? They have hands, and they resemble us a lot more than birds do. But it didn't work with them either, as you point out. And you write, I like this sentence very much here. You write in the chapter later on in the book about language, the reason that speech is so extraordinary, so paranormal and wizardly, I love those words to describe it, is that the banal act of hearing coughs and gurgles sputter out of someone's lippy mouth triggers the eruption of vivid meaning inside the invisible realm of our private awareness.
Yes. You know, that, oh, go ahead, Sai.
That is the beauty of language, isn't it? And it also points to something very interesting. So language allows us to take what is a conscious experience that's unfolding over time. So when you're listening to me, it's a wave of vibrations that's unfolding over time, and that's somehow being converted into meaning. And this took a while. This took a long time. And the surprising thing is that we somehow figured out how to use our hands to connect it to meaning. And then once that was possible, and once we had the mental faculties to figure out how we could connect arbitrary things to meaning, we then perhaps switched over to the spoken word.
If I could add one more thing about language, we might be thinking, oh, language is a unique phenomenon in the universe, just an extraordinary thing. But actually, it fulfills a pattern that has occurred throughout the journey of the mind, perhaps the single most important pattern in the history of thinking on Earth, and that is this. There have been several distinctive stages in thinking on Earth, several distinctive stages of minds where the form of thinking and sort of the basic nature of the mind is different as we progress up this scale of 4 stages. Let me review them really quick, but what's important and why I'm bringing this up with regard to language is that each of the transitions between stages, from one stage to a higher stage, always involves a new form of connectivity, a new form of minds or thinking elements communicating with each other. Once a new form of connectivity emerges, a new stage of mind emerges. So I'll actually start at the top level, the 4th level. The form of connectivity is language. And the minds that came after language were not the individual human minds, but rather the human supermind. We are part of a single mind whose thinking consists of language, because language binds together the elements in it. Let's go back to the first. The first stage of thinking on Earth were molecule minds. These are the protozoa, bacteria, archaea, tiny microscopic minds. Their thinking elements are individual molecules that we can identify. So the first thinking on Earth, the minds consisted of molecules interacting with each other. Then the transition to stage 2. Stage 2 are neuron minds. The thinking element in these minds are neurons, and these are jellyfish, insects, worms, invertebrates. All invertebrates have neuron minds. What was the connectivity that allowed us to go from molecule minds to neuron minds? It was molecular communication, molecular signals between different minds. So in neuron minds, the thinking element is the neuron. Each neuron is a self-contained molecule mind. Each neuron is a mind on its own. It has the same dynamics that the neuron minds like bacteria and protozoa do. The third stage of thinking are module minds. What's a module? A module is just a network of neurons with a specific purpose. So we have a visual recognition module in our brain that recognizes visual objects. We have a navigation module that helps us move around the world. So in the module minds, the thinking element are the modules. How do modules communicate with each other? Through representations, through mental representations. A representation is just a collection of signals, but you can have, for example, a representation of a visual representation of this bottle that I'm holding up, for example. So molecule minds learn to communicate with each other through molecular signals giving rise to neuron minds. Neuron minds turned into networks that communicated with each other through representations. And then the fourth stage of thinking, module minds, that is to say, human minds, learn to communicate with each other through language, thereby binding us together in a supermind. And it is the human supermind, which is the most advanced mind on Earth, not the individual human brain.
Let me take a little detour because music has come up a few times, and obviously it takes a super brain to create the great masterworks of music that have been with us humans for a tiny, tiny speck of time with regard to the big picture, but certainly our past generations and the future generations are going to be listening to a lot of the same pieces of music, like a Mozart symphony or a Beethoven string quartet or wonderful Indian music. In fact, there was a wonderful singer who I liked very much who died recently at the age of 90, was it 99? The very famous Indian singer.
Lata Mangeshkar. Wow.
Yeah, who I'm a huge fan of, and people will be listening to her for generations to come. Say her name once so we know how to pronounce it.
It's Lata Mangeshkar, probably
Lata
the most
Mangeshkar.
widely heard singer on the planet.
Exactly. So whatever music is to you, it is something to you. So Sai Gaddam, you go first. What is music to you? What do you listen to? How does music play into your thinking? And how extraordinary is it? Is music a miracle?
Music is a miracle that I don't unfortunately appreciate as much as maybe others do. So I do listen to music, but my music tastes are, I would say, pedestrian all over the place. But for me, here's what's fascinating about music, and I have perhaps a cognitive, non-emotional perspective. Music is about rhythm. It's about periodicity, and what's so fascinating is how rhythm and periodicity permeate the very journey of the mind itself, and that's what I take the most from music. And what I mean by that is, Ogi had mentioned this idea of resonance, which is the fundamental dynamics of consciousness. And that is nothing but neurons singing to each other in some ways. I mean, this is a metaphorical way of putting it. But and the music is from this the synchrony of neurons in different parts of the brain saying, hey, this is something that we must pay attention to. And I think music, I think any rhythmic activity, maybe dance fits in that as well, is exactly what it does for us. It allows us to synchronize. It allows us to come together and coalesce for a moment with society at large and be one.
Daniel, I can share with you some interesting facts about the musical mind, because this unified account of the mind that we describe in Journey of the Mind actually has something quite remarkable to say about the human musical brain. And it's this. So one aspect of consciousness that might be a bit surprising to many people is it turns out there's many structures in our brain that can produce conscious experience. Any part of the brain that can create what's called a resonant dynamic, a special kind of physical activity, can produce consciousness. And so our conscious experience at any given moment usually consists of multiple forms of simultaneous consciousness. Simple example, you're listening to my voice, and for those viewers who are watching this on YouTube or in a video, you're seeing me as well. We're conscious of the sound and sight at the same time. These two forms of consciousness resonate together in a seamless experience. How does this inform our understanding of music? It turns out that there are 4 distinct parts of our brain that separately process conscious experiences of music. One part of our brain is conscious of melody. Another part of our brain is conscious of rhythm. Another part conscious of lyrics. And then there's a part of our brain conscious of timbre. Each of these are separate. Each of these can generate a distinct conscious experience. Each of these can generate its own rewards. This
and
is
how
sword.
unique, just pause for a minute, and how unique is it that there would be 4 different parts of the brain processing music? Because as I've read, it's very unusual for so many different parts of the brain to be activated by one input, meaning music. Isn't that unusual in itself?
It's ultimately about language. The reason we have these 4 different structures, these were all evolved for communication, for language. In fact, the only creatures on Earth besides humans that have rhythm, that are conscious of rhythm, are able to extract rhythm, are able to dance to a beat, they're all vocal learners too. So learning to communicate vocally seems to have given rise to these 4 forms of consciousness that it turns out that we can enjoy as music. And the fact that there's 4 distinct parts of our brain that are generating conscious, rewarding experiences from listening to music helps us understand why there's such diversity in musical tastes, because each of us has a different relationship to each of these 4 forms of consciousness. Some people might have a more developed rhythm brain. They might just be wired to enjoy rhythm more than melody, for example. Others might be more wired to pay attention to the lyrics. Other people might like certain kinds of melody, legato melodies as opposed to staccato melodies. Maybe melodies that are fast rather than slow. We each have our own individual taste on each of these 4 brain components. And yet these 4 conscious, discrete conscious parts of music listening can seamlessly come together to form that holistic experience of music. We can be conscious of a musical piece like the Brandenburg Concerto, all those different melodic lines playing together, the rhythm, there's no lyrics in it. I should have chosen an example with lyrics, but all of these merge together through the resonance, different conscious states resonating together to give us this beautiful, engrossing mental experience. One reason music is so engrossing is because it's involving so many parts of our brain, so many conscious experiences at the same time. It's utterly unique in its ability to enthrall us. And a big reason why is because there's so many developed parts of the brain that are conscious at the same time.
Where do we go from here? We look at the history. We look at this wonderful book. We look at a lot of the essays you've written, the research you've done. Where are human minds in 2022? And I'd like both of you to analyze that and also talk about the risks that we don't know yet of the huge exposure we have, for example, to our cell phone, to social media, that especially for young people younger than I am, let's say a generation younger than I am. I'm a millennial, but let's say they're on their phone even more than I am. They have it under their pillow at night, or I hear stories about people waking up every hour to look at their phone or something. What's going to happen? Is that going to damage us? Are we going to morph into computers at some point?
I mentioned there's 4 distinct stages of minds on Earth: molecule minds, neuron minds, module minds, superminds. We are the superminds. And I mentioned that each of these stages, there's a transition between each of these stages that's driven by a new form of connectivity. Here's what's fascinating. Right now in our world, a new form of connectivity has emerged that connects superminds together. Superminds we can think of right now as countries. There's an American supermind, there's a Russian supermind, there's a French supermind, and the internet is binding these superminds together. It's a new form of connectivity. What this suggests is that we are at the very earliest stages of a new stage of thinking coming into being. Perhaps the superminds on Earth, these different human nations, these different human societies, will merge together through the internet and perhaps other forms of connectivity. Globalization seems to be falling apart a little bit. I actually am skeptical. I don't think it's falling apart all that much because of Russia. And another example you cited, social media. Social media is a powerful form of a connectivity mediated through the internet that's giving each person a voice. When every mental element, when every thinking element in a mind is given its own voice, that usually leads to the emergence of a new stage of thinking. And even though right now we associate social media with partisanship, polarization, unlimited expression of hatred, at the same time, there's something very valuable in it. It's giving everybody a voice. If we want to ascend to a new stage of consciousness, a new stage of connectivity, a new stage of compassion and love and resilience, we need to find a new way to connect. Social media is trying to figure out right now the new dynamics that will allow for this ascension. Right now, it's a lot of fury and hate and conflict, but everybody's trying to figure out, how can we control this? How can we allow everyone to have a voice, but moderate this, manage this in a way that it doesn't lead to conflicts or wars or that sort of thing. We've got a long way to go to figure it all out, but this is what it always looked like in the past when a new stage of thinking was starting to come into being.
And Daniel, you mentioned cell phones. Every time there's a new technology, especially a communication technology, it really does change the world forever in some ways, and not often in ways that we think it will. So there's a wonderful book, the Victorian Internet, talks about the telegram and what people expected would happen, and how this new connectivity of the world would usher in world peace. Well, nothing like that happened. It was used for business. It was used for gossip. Cell phones too. I mean, it's a form of connectivity that really does connect us all together, but we are yet to figure out how to take control of it, and that's a process that will take time, because we are still figuring out what this fire hose of communication that's just sort of jacked into your brains does to us. And you're right. I think we need to look closely at what it does to younger minds, because minds, I mean, all minds adapt. They're resilient, flexible. Ours are as well. But in our case, it takes us decades after puberty to figure out who we are, how to take control of our impulses, understand that what we think is great for us in the near term is not necessarily great in the longer term. And this takes a while. But will we have that time? Will young, impressionable minds have that time when we're jacked with this fire hose of information? Some will. And that's what's great about this supermind that we inhabit. And I think not everyone needs to figure it out. I think some of us need to figure it out and then communicate what's the right way to take control of this technology for the good for the collective good.
Why do you think it's important? Lastly, what I want to hear from both of you, why do you think it's important that we think about what came before, both what came before 100 years ago and 1 billion years ago? Why is it useful for us to read about where we humans fit into the progression of life and thinking and eventually consciousness on planet Earth?
I think we take a privileged position in the world and in the universe. We think, so many of us have, if you look at our trajectory, our very limited trajectory, it's always been somewhat grand in our thinking that we are unique, we are special. And this has made us do things which has put so many other organisms, putting the world at a disadvantage. I think we must look back to understand how connected we are, how we are part of a continuum, because we're not we don't sit alone on a pedestal. We are here with every other mind that inhabits this universe. We in fact, as we speak, we are tapping into minds that came before us. The words that we use are gifts of the gift of humanity that came before us, and that builds on, as Ogi said, there's a pyramid of minds, and all of these are connected, and that's what made our current experiences possible. And it's important for us to know this, so that there's humility in understanding what we can do and what we must do, and how we can go ahead in ways understanding that our great powers, we do have unparalleled powers. Our minds have unparalleled powers when compared to what came before us. But and we don't yet know what we can do with that. We don't have full comprehension of that. And to really get that, we must look back and see the trajectory, understand the full story. Only the story, only the journey will let us know where we stand and with what humility we must proceed.
One of the most important lessons from the journey of the mind, and perhaps the most relevant lesson to understanding our place in the universe, is this: we tend to think of consciousness as the pinnacle of evolution, as the pinnacle of biology and life, and certainly the pinnacle of thinking on Earth. And yet, that's simply not true. Despite our own species' understandable fixation on consciousness, its emergence is not the climax of the story of minds. Even though it's astonishing, consciousness is a simple stepping stone in the cosmic odyssey of mind as it strives to subdue the relentless forces of chaos. Here's what's important. After consciousness, there have been two more major innovations in the journey of the mind. The first was language. Language emerged much, much, much later than consciousness. And then the human self, our experience, I am me, our awareness of ourself, that too is a critical innovation that came much later than consciousness. It came later than language. And what we see by retracing the journey of the mind, and this is why, to answer your question, Daniel, why it's so important to consider the past, to consider history, if we want to understand where we're going and who we are, is that we see there's a nonstop relationship between minds and chaos. Chaos, the random physical activity of the universe, the laws of physics. The mind is constantly seeking to master chaos. And this is why there's stages of thinking. Each new stage masters a new range of chaos. Consciousness helped vertebrates manage chaos. Then we acquired language that allow us to spread outside of our world. Now our environment includes planets and the moons. We can fly to the moon, we can fly to Mars, we can observe other galaxies, we can talk about and analyze and think about what's happening in other galaxies. Our purview has expanded, but it's not over. I mentioned we seem to be on the verge of the development of a new stage of mind. There's no reason this will stop. There's no reason why there will continue to be mental innovations at different hierarchical levels. So it won't be our own brains that are evolving too much. It'll be the system of minds that we're embedded in that will continue to evolve. And there's no suggestion that there's an end to this. This might be the fundamental structure of reality, an endless dance between mind and chaos, mind constantly involving new innovations to master chaos. And that only opens up new realms of chaos to us that we then have to master. So thinking about our place in the universe, we're very special on Earth, but we are not the end point. We are a stepping stone in this never-ending story of feeling, knowing, and experiencing in the universe.
A never-ending dance. That's a good way to put it, between mind and chaos. In fact, both of those words are in the title of the book, which I have right here, holding it up for those people watching, Journey of the Mind, How Thinking Emerged from Chaos. So glad to have had you both. Fascinating stuff, and there's a lot to think about. Sai Gaddam and Ogi Ogas. Indeed, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Wonderful talk.